good to us. You're so generous with us. You give us everything we need, and we are so amazed, and we want to worship you this morning as we study your word. I pray that you would work in our hearts, that as we look at sin and as we look at the nature of sin this morning, and we would be amazed that you would want anything to do with us, and let alone just save us and now becoming your sons and daughters. We worship you for that, for your kindness and your mercy. Amen. All right, so we are going to look at, I know that if you look at your notes, it says the origin of sin. You see that up there on the very, very top? That's wrong. Someone got in my computer and did. No, it actually, we're going to talk about the origin of sin in the next few weeks, but not today. Today, what I wanted to look at is I wanted to go further into the definition of sin. Last time, do you remember? It was 2 weeks ago, so you might not remember. I hardly remember myself, but I remember looking at my notes that we talked about a definition of sin. And we talked about some common false definitions. Is that sounding now true? Remember we talked about that duality theory? Do you remember that? That there isn't just a spiritual world and a physical world, and if you sin, it's just in the physical world. And we even brought it to like our everyday, Southern California Christian vernacular, right? And then we looked at the privation theory, right? We said that it's not the fact that we're finite, that we're sinners because we're sinners. That's what we're going to look in the next few weeks. And then we talked about the illusion theory, and there's some people out there that think that sin is just an illusion, an idea. We talked about the desire theory. We talked about the accident theory, how a lot of people think that sin has just happened out of an accident. And then we talked about how sin, some people have incomplete ideas of sin. And we talked about how some of us even would think that sin is just the absence of goodness, or the sin is just unbelief, or the sin is lawlessness alone, or sin is just pride alone, or sin is selfishness alone. And then we ended up kind of constructing a definition of sin, right? And that's what I want to talk about this morning. I want to talk about two things if we have time. Number one is I want to look at a biblical definition of sin and kind of break it apart and look at the nature of sin. And then, if we have time, I want to look at, as you see, the number 3 is Adam and Eve before the fall. And where did they fall from? In a few weeks, we're going to look at the fall. But we need to understand where did they fall from? What was the fall about? Who were Adam and Eve in that sense before the fall? And we have this idea, right, that Adam and Eve were just, blank slates. But they were not, as we are going to see. So let's look at your notes right here when we have a biblical definition of sin. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, so when I say last week, I mean 2 weeks ago, just in case okay, just don't listen to my words, listen to what I mean, which is last week, 2 weeks ago, right? We looked at a couple of definitions of sin, and we ended quickly because we needed to finish. We had to go to the service. But because this is a adult Sunday school class, equipping class, we have more time to go through some of these things. And so I kind of want to look at some of the definitions that you have here. And then I want us to unpack the definition. So for example, let's look at the first one, right? Before we look at the first one. If someone comes up to you, right? Let's say someone comes out from the street and shows up for the first time at church. And you ask them the question, hey, are you here? Is this your first time? And they're like, yeah, I am. I'm here for the first time. I actually heard great things about this church. I heard the service is really good, and I hear the people are really nice. But I have a question for you. I was reading the Bible, Romans, a book. Have you heard of Romans? They'll tell you. You're like, yeah, I think I've heard of that epistle. And you're like, there's the word sin. What does that mean, really? Like, what does it mean that we sin? Because for me, sin means something really, really, really bad. But what does this church teach that sin is? What would you say to them? Now, that will happen. Maybe it has happened to you already. Maybe it wasn't someone that just came off the street. Maybe you were talking to someone at work. Maybe you were talking to someone and they're asking you questions like, what is sin, right? I never forget this conversation I had. I was in college. I was a new believer. I was talking to this guy. And this guy said to me, what is sin? So I said, well, like, bad things that we do. And he was like, okay, really? Just bad things? And I really felt like I needed some help defining sin, right? So what would you say? Well, look at this. Last week we read some of these definitions. And the first one in your notes. Look at your notes there. Who wants to read the first definition by Erickson there? Yeah, Derek.
Sin is any lack of conformity, active or passive, to the moral law of God. This may be a matter of act, of thought, of inner disposition, or state. Sin is failure to live up to what God expects us in act, thought, and be.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so now we look at this definition, and you look at, okay, there are some things here that we need to make clear. This is probably one of the best definitions I've seen. I've actually have seen and actually looked at. But okay, so we need to understand. Okay, what does he mean by some of the things? For example, what does he mean by the moral law of God? Does he mean like the 10 Commandments? What do you guys think? This is not a rhetorical question. What is the moral law of God? God's standards, right? Exactly. It's not the 10 Commandments. We know that, right? Why? Well, because they were sin before the 10 Commandments, right? It wasn't like all of a sudden there were 10 Commandments. People were like, oh, yeah, stealing is wrong. I shouldn't steal. Oh, no, I shouldn't worship another God. People knew that. It was, finally, all of you who are in care group, you looked at, the Mosaic Covenant, right? Are we under the Mosaic Covenant? No, we are not. Some of you were like, well, maybe. We're not under the Mosaic Covenant, right? Does it mean that the Mosaic Covenant is wrong? Obviously, Paul would say no. Obviously, no, right? So the moral law of God is God's standard, right? The law of God is basically understanding it in this way. God is the creator, and you're just a creature, right? God is the one that dictates what's wrong and what's right, and you submit to it. Now, we have a huge problem in our society. Why? Yes, number one, submission. Why do we have a problem submitting?
We want to be God.
We want to be God, right? We found every available theory, let's call it that, to say there is no God. No one has created that. And if I can erase that, right? And if I can erase the fact that God is actually the creator, then I don't have to owe him anything. I don't owe God a thing. Why? Because God didn't create me. I'm just an accident, right? I'm an accident that happened 1 billion years ago, or many, many billions years ago. That keeps changing, as you know, right? And many, many billions years ago, and now it's me. I'm here. I don't owe anyone anything. This is one of the reasons why when we share the gospel, one of the non-negotiables is for you to tell the person that you were sharing the gospel that God has created them. Not to teach him a class on creationism, right? It's to tell him God has created you because you owe him your allegiance. You owe him everything. He has made you, and now you need to obey him. So if God is not the creator, then who cares what he says in this Bible, right? So you have to start with that. Is God is the creator. He's the one that sets the standards. And he's the one who says what's right and what's wrong, right? All of that is inside of our hearts. He's the one that has written that law inside of people's heart, that moral law, right? So look at this. So he says, he talks about lack of conformity, right, to the moral law of God. And then he says, by means of active or passive, right? What does it mean, first of all, lack of conformity? Anyone? Not meeting the standard, right? Not meeting the standard. And it says by passive or active. It's by doing something or by not doing something. Or by default saying, well, I'm not going to do this, right? And then look at this. He doesn't give us an out. An act, and thought, inner disposition, or state. Do you hear that? It's act, what we do, what we think, our attitudes. This is why it's so important as we work on our attitude, right? And this is why sometimes kids would get disciplined, right? Because they're having a bad attitude. And they're like, well, it's just an attitude. Well, that's sin, right? Or state. Now, we're going to talk about this in the future when we talked about how we are sinners and how sin is woven in us all the time. But basically, sin is a failure to live up to what God expects of you and me in act, in thought, and in being. So even though, just imagine you are perfect. Let's say you were born and you never did anything wrong. You never had a bad attitude in your life. Just imagine you were just Mr. or Mrs. This good disposition. You behaved perfectly, right? And then, even those of us that have really good kids, I don't, but let's just imagine you have good kids. They still are sinners. But just imagine your kids are so good, so compliant. Are they sinners? Yes, right? Even if they didn't do anything wrong. Why? They're born sinners, right? Because sadly, you are a sinner, then your kid is a sinner, and so forth and so on. So, just to break that apart a little, we need to understand together what we're saying when we're talking about the moral law of God, and that this is a standard set by God. It's not set by any human. God is the one who sets this standard. Now look at what Paul Enns says. Now, be in your definition. By the way, Paul Enns has this book, and I'm blanking on the name right now, and it's down here probably. It's called the Moody Handbook of Theology. The Moody Handbook of Theology. If you don't own that book, it would be a good book for you to own if you want to continue studying theology. It's very, very helpful. I think now they're up to their third edition by Paul Enns. Very, very helpful book, and actually deals with all of these things. But Paul Enns says this. Look, he says, and there's, you see there are ellipses between all of these things because he actually explains these. I just pulled these quotes from it. He said, sin is a transgression of the law of God. We've seen that. Sin is a failure to conform to the standard of God. We looked at that. Sin is principle within men. We looked at that. Sin is rebellion against God. We looked at that. And sin is wrongful acts towards God and men. It's not just that God, that sin is just a disposition. It's actually wrongful acts as well. And I like that he does that. He takes what sin is and explains every single one of these things. Charles Ryrie says, an inclusive definition of sin would be anything that does not conform to the glory of God. And indeed, that is the standard against which sin is measured in the familiar verse, Romans 3:23, that says, all have sinned what? Exactly, that is the standard. Fall short of the glory of God. The glory of God, we are not able to reach that standard. verse in one of the versions in Spanish that I used to teach it. It says, "For all have sinned, and we can't reach the glory of God." That's what it says. And I really like that idea that someone's trying to reach for something, right? He's trying to reach the glory of God, but he can't. He or she has sinned and can't reach that. So based on this, we can say this, that sin is any attitude, any act, any disposition, nature, anything that does not conform to God's moral law. And what is God's moral law in a sense? It's to be holy as I am holy, right? If you can do that, then you have not sinned, right? So if you're not a sinner since you're born, if you're perfectly holy like God is holy, then you have not sinned. But the problem is, all of us have sinned. All of us. Not one person has not sinned, except for one person, right? Jesus. But that's it. So now, what I want to look at this morning is, now that we looked at this definition, I'm going to go to your questions in 1 second if you have any questions. But now we look at this definition, we need to unpack this a little more, and we're going to talk about the nature of sin, just the nature of sin. Some of these things are kind of ethereal to us, right? We look at sin and we know it's bad. But in a sense, what does that mean? How can we explain that even further? So before we get to the nature of sin, are there any questions when we talk about the definition of sin? And I reserve the right to say we're going to look at this in the future, by the way, just in case. Any questions? Well, great. That's great. Okay. So when we look at the nature of sin, you have this in your notes. Some of these are very self-evident, but we still need to mention it. I was showing the notes to John, and one of them, and the other sentence says that sin is wrong. And John was like, "No kidding." It's like, great. But we need to still talk about that, right? Sin is wrong. So the first one right here, look at this. Sin is real evil. I'm not talking about, I'm not using real there as a very, another word for very, but it's actually the fact that it's actually a real evil. It's not just a made up word. It's not this idea that we talked about a couple weeks ago when we talked about this perceived idea of evil. No, sin is real evil. As in opposition to all the theories that you looked at, and you can look at in philosophy or even some world religions, sin is not an illusion. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Sin is not limitation, right? But theologians call this, when they say sin is a real evil, and then I'm going to teach you a theological idea here, which is crazy. They say, when they say sin is real evil, they say sin is a positive something. Do you hear that? Sounds like a kid made that up, right? It's a positive something. What does that mean? Well, when you say that sin is a positive something, it means that sin can stand by itself. It's not the absence of something like we talked about last time. Do you remember when we talked about that sin was not the absence of goodness a couple weeks ago? Do you remember that? Just say yes to make me feel better at least. We talked about that. Sin is not the absence of sin by itself. It's a positive something. It's something that stands by itself. And by this, theologians mean that sin is, biblically, it's evil. And in opposition to all the views in the world that make sin necessary for good, sin is actually evil by itself. There are many views out there. Even some of these views you've never heard of, but you've heard what they teach. When you look at pantheism, what is pantheism? You know what pantheism is, right? What's that? No, not, well, yeah, multi-gods in a sense, but what do they say, the pantheists? Worship nature, why? Yes, so God is everywhere. Everything you see, everything you touch, everything you feel is God, they would say, right? So the whole world needs to be taken as a whole, and that is God. That's kind of an idea that we have nowadays, right? A lot of people look at this world and they worship the creature more than they worship the creator. So in this view, in the pantheistic view, evil is necessary for what? For you to understand that good exists. Without evil, goodness doesn't exist. Now, that goes completely against what the Bible teaches, right? Evil doesn't need to exist in order for good to exist. God has always been good, right? God didn't become good after sin entered into the world, as we're going to look at, right? God was always good. God was always holy. Sin didn't need to be there. But that is a view. Or there's also another view, and this is more familiar to us. And maybe not by name, but the view is called the antagonism view. So basically, this view is that evil is the absolute necessity for someone to be good or to show virtue. You see this in Marvel movies, right? In superhero movies. You see this a lot in books where they deal with superheroes. A superhero can't be a superhero if he doesn't have someone to fight against, an arch enemy, right? Superman wouldn't be Superman if he doesn't have his arch enemy. Batman wouldn't be Batman if he doesn't have his arch enemies, and so forth and so on, right? Obviously, these views are lacking something. Biblical truth, right? All of them, right? Not one of them are biblical. We don't hold to any of this. We don't think that for God to be God, Satan needs to be around, right? We don't hold to this idea that the world is, God is everything in this world, and evil needs to exist so that we understand what good is in this world. We would never hold to that. Rather, look at this quote from John Murray. It says, "We hold that God has decreed sin and embraced it in his plan for wise and holy ends, but not because it is necessary for himself, nor for the existence of good." Now, there's a lot in that, and we're going to talk about this in the future when we talk about the fall, and when we talk about God's sovereignty over the fall, and we're going to talk about God's sovereignty over the fall of Satan and demons. But just suffice it to know, right? We hold to the fact that God didn't say, "Hey, you know what? What we need in this world is some fun. I need to show people that good exists, so we're going to create some evil," right? No. God was not J.R.R. Tolkien writing Golem so that, or Sauron, or the Bad Ring, right? For this to happen. Yes, carry out.
Is it okay to think though that maybe one of the purposes of sin is to like highlight and showcase God's goodness?
Yes.
Not that it's necessary.
Yes. Of course, and we're going to talk about this. We showcase a side of God that what hasn't been seen, right? When I say side of God, I don't mean there's many sides to God, but it's like we get to see his goodness, his mercy, his generosity. Yes, when sin entered into the world, right? We get to see, as Paul says in Ephesians, right? For the praise of his glory, all these things are happening for him, right? Everything, as Romans 12 says, is for him, or Romans 11. It's for him. You guys have been in Romans longer than me. But that's the idea. Yes, but this is not this idea of it is necessary for God to be good. That's what I'm talking about ontologically, right? Ontologically, for God to be good, there needs to be evil, right? For God to be actually good, for God to be a savior, then there needs to be evil in the world. You have no idea how many people, even in Christian circles, have that idea, right? They bought into this whole idea that Satan is God's arch enemy, that Satan is unequal to God, that there's this evil, there's this like cosmic battle between Satan and God. Have you heard that? Even in Christian circles, right? There are, I was going to say denominations, but there are churches out there. Sadly, we shouldn't make fun of them. It should really it really should grieve our hearts that there are people in these churches being led astray, thinking that they can fight Satan, thinking that they could tail Satan off, and that God is fighting Satan over them constantly. God does not fight Satan. Satan is not God's equal, ever. And if you have questions about that, just read in the book of Job. And that should be basically shut that door of asking, are they equal? Are they co-equal? There are a lot of churches out there that hold their people captive, thinking, hey, you know what? The moment you do this, you lose your salvation because God can't hold you, right? Losing your salvation is more than just losing your salvation. It's saying, God can't hold me. Satan can take me away from him. That goes completely against what even Jesus said, right? Father holds us in his hands, and no one can take us. No one can snatch us out of that hand, right? Any questions with that? That's a great question, Gariel. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Charles.
Degrees of sin. Sin is sin, obviously.
Yes.
Do we understand that God looks at some sin as worse than others, or in his eyes, it's just all evil?
In his eyes, all is evil, but there are degrees of sin, right? We understand that. And we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about, are there degrees of sin when we look at, is murder worse than, I would say this, just quickly. There are degrees of sins in punishment. For sure, right? If I go, on who you sin against, right? Also. But if I go to the store and I take one grape and I eat it, is that sin? Purgatory. You have to see if it's good. Yeah, that's true. What if I take a Snickers bar and I open it? I just want to see if it's good. Can I eat it? It's good, I promise you. Can I eat it? Now, what if I go to the cash register and say, give me all your money or I'll blow your brains out? And if I go to a bigger place, a bank, and if I shoot someone, you see that? So if I take a grape and I eat it, no one's going to say anything. Is that stealing? I think it is. Right? It's not your grape, unless you say, hey, charge me for a grape. I want to see if it's good or not, right? Charge me for one grape. Right? Yes, so you pay for it. There's all these ways. So the next week, we're going to talk about how do we dress our sin up in a godly way, okay? I'm going to teach you how to do it. I'm joking. So you see, like, there are varying degrees. So now all of that is sin against God, right? I mean, I know it's going to be sad when I say this, but going over the speed limit is sin, right? I'm not looking. Going over the speed limit is sin. I'm looking down. I'm not looking at some people going like this. So is that a lesser sin than insulting someone or slandering someone? Sin is evil. But there are varying degrees of punishment for that, right? You might get a ticket for going 66 in the freeway. No one will, but just imagine you do. But you might lose a friendship over a slander. Or no one would seemingly find out that you were slandering someone else. So that's the idea. Evil is evil, right?
But in God's eyes, he's not going to look at a lesser degree of sin as, well, that's not so bad.
No, of course not. And that's what people, I think, because we confuse constantly this idea of how I view sin. So we say things like, well, it's not so bad. They're white lies. I mean, it's fine. I mean, we don't, I don't want to, we say things like, what, it's just a grape, right? Or we look at sin that way. But we don't look at it as it really is. It's an affront against God, right? It's that you're breaking God's moral law. It's just me telling that person this thing about that other person. I'm just slandering, but we're just friends. We're having coffee or tea, whatever. Yeah.
One way to be able to understand from God's perspective is whether you have that on that full spectrum of sin, that even a little slander, that is enough to send us to hell.
Yes, because remember what James says, right? What does James say about this? That if you break one commandment, you're guilty of the whole law. So you look at that and you think it cannot. Even like a small little thing, right? This is why when we parent, and this is not parenting class, but when we parent, we take our kids' sins maybe a little more serious than our sin, right? When they're fighting or arguing with their brother, we take it very seriously. Why? Hopefully it's not because they bother you, but it's because you see that that's an affront against God. So you take every sin seriously and you want to impress upon them, look, you're breaking God's law. God has demanded this. And you're not meeting him. That's a great opportunity for the gospel constantly. But yeah, you're guilty of just something really small. You're guilty of the whole law. But I think, again, because humans are not, as humans, we're not programmed to look at that. We're programmed to see that we're better than someone else. So I'm not as bad, as that other person. I just took one grape. I didn't take a Snickers bar. I didn't take $10, from my mom's wallet and so forth and so on, right? Is that clear? Anything else when we look at this? All right. So look at this. So we saw this sin is a real evil, but then also sin is a specific evil. Sin is a specific evil. Sometimes when we think of evil, we think of calamities, right? We think of crime. We think of disease. We think of death. And all of that are consequences of sin, right? But sin belongs in a separate category, which is an affront against God. It is breaking God's law, as we saw earlier. It's not conforming to God's standard, the standard that he has given to all of us, right? So when we see this, we're saying that sin is a moral evil. Sin is a moral evil. There's a great quote by Louis Berkhoff there in your notes. Chris, maybe I'll ask you to read. I like your commanding voice.
There can be no doubt about its ethical character of sin. It's not a calamity that came upon man unawares, poisoned his life and ruined his happiness, but an evil course which man has deliberately chosen to follow, and which carries untold misery with it. Fundamentally, it is not something passive, such as a weakness, a fault, or an imperfection, for which we cannot be held responsible, but an active opposition to God. A positive transgression of his laws, which constitutes guilt. Sin is a result of a free but evil choice of man.
Thank you. So sin is a moral evil. I really like this quote. This is one of those quotes that if I could frame quotes, I would put it up there, because I think that sometimes we look at what Berkhoff is saying here is we think that sin is just what's around us, and not what's really in us. That's kind of we think of sin as like, oh, that calamity, that crime. Oh man, the world is terrible. But really, it's our moral evil, right? Something within us, and with it, Look at this letter, the first one, number 1 there, Roman numeral, small numeral 1 in your notes at the bottom says, sin is wrong. Just in case you were wondering, sin is wrong. Now, what does that mean? This is not to belabor the point. But sin is wrong. What I mean by that is that it is coming short of a moral imperative. It is a violation of what theologians call a category of ought. Ought. What we ought to do. God has been very specific as to what we ought to do. And sin is everything we have done against what God has asked us to do. Right? The very first sin, we're going to look at this when we look at the fall of humanity, right? The very first sin was God asking Adam and Eve. He didn't give him 10 commandments. He didn't give him 100 commandments, right? He gave him one. What do you say? What's that?
Don't eat of that tree.
Yes, but before that he said, you can eat out of everything. Go ahead. Except one thing. So sin is wrong, right? Sin is wrong. But also, sin is a violation of God's law. This is not just some ethereal thing out there that we don't know what God is talking about, right? Sin is actually every time you violate God's law. And again, we talk about the moral law of God. Slander is sin. Speaking ill of others is sin. Sexual immorality is sin. And we always think of the big categories are a violation of God's law, but just even smaller categories are a violation of God's law. And third, and this is very important for us in our culture, sin's ethical character. Sin's ethical character. Again, sin is not just mere calamity that wreaks havoc among people, not a mere just social disruption. Sin is sin. Sin is sin. We live in a world where we say things, the car isn't used, it's certified pre-owned. Right? Have you heard that before? We don't say things like, she's sick. We say things like, she's under the weather. People don't go to prison, they go to correctional facilities. He's not poor, he's just economically disadvantaged. I'm not short, I'm vertically challenged. She didn't break up with me, she just needed some space. We exchange even words like, fornication to sexually active, or adultery to having a midlife crisis, right? According to the Bible, humanity is not a victim of its circumstances, right? We are not passive humans who just live in a world and then just sin happens to us. Rather, we are the perpetrators of sin. Sin has an ethical character to it. So according to the Bible, we're not passive, right? We're not just, we're humans and sin's just going to come at us and we're just going to look at it. I remember when I was growing up, if you are my age or maybe a tiny bit older or a tiny bit younger than me, there was a campaign in Christian churches, maybe you were a part of that campaign too, where they were trying to sanitize Christian kids. And the way they did it, it wasn't by pouring Purell all over them, right? How did they sanitize Christian kids? Do you remember what they did in the 80s? Those of you that were alive in the 80s and were of age of watching TV, what do parents do? Yeah, well, that's a good one. That is a really good one. Yeah, we just started. I remember, maybe I grew up in a home differently than a lot of you, but there were shows that we were not allowed to watch. One of them was the Smurfs. We were not allowed to watch. How many of you were not allowed to watch the Smurfs? I was alone? I know there's more of you. So we were not allowed to watch the Smurfs. Why? Because it had Gargamel. Who was Gargamel? He was a bad guy, but what did he do? What's that? He hates Smurfs. What did he do? What was he? What was his profession? Sorcery. Right? So we were not allowed to watch that. We were not allowed to watch all those shows from the mid-'80s. They had sorcery or they had any kind of those things. Now, I'm not saying that's bad, right? But we were not allowed to own like play guns and things like that because that would lead to crime in the future. But guess what happened? The evil was inside of us. It wasn't on the TV. Now, I'm not saying don't look at what your kids watch. Yes, do that. It's very important. But know this, as you're doing that, know that the evil is not it's not inside of the TV. The evil is inside of your kids. Even if they're cute, they're still evil. So that's really important to know that it's not just this idea of, hey, if I send them to a better school, they're going to be saved. If I do this, then they're going to be saved. I know kids, they went to public school in the inner city and they're saved. And then I know kids that didn't do that and they went to private school, Christian private school, and they're not saved, right? Why? The issue is the heart, right? And we know that. But I think that we have this idea sometimes that we forget that sin has that ethical character to it. And we can see that. We would say things like, oh, no, yeah, I understand that's fornication. It's not being sexually active. But then when it comes to other things, we're like, no, just the surrounding influences are the more important things. They're important. I'm not saying they're not. But you need to also go to the heart of the kids. Again, this is not and go to your heart too. This is not a parenting class. No, it's just your heart as well. Any questions on that? Any questions on who the Smurfs were? Who was He-Man? Do you know that? No. Yes, question. You had a question? No. Someone here? I thought someone had a question. I saw a hand up. C. Look at the notes here. Sin has an absolute character. Sin has an absolute character. What we need to know about sin is that as we talk about ethics in sin, is that there is a contrast between good and evil, but there are not shades of gray. It's black and white. The contrast is absolute. There is no neutral condition between sin, right? There are no gradations between the good and evil. A moral being that is good doesn't become evil by simply diminishing its goodness, right? Going back to James again, you break one law, you're guilty of breaking the whole law. The whole law. And this is really interesting because a lot of the time we turn to think this way. We use the word good very, we use it all the time. And we're like, well, yes, he's a sinner, but he's good. And I know what we mean, but according to the Bible, no one is good. Only God is, right? Jesus said, he who's not with me, it's against me. That's it. There are, shades of believer. You hear this all the time, and I know what people mean. They say they're almost a believer, right? They're so close, right? And we like to say, well, they're so close, but they're so far, right? Even Jesus says, if you are not with me, you are against me. He said it. And remember, like people out there in the world, they'll say, Jesus preached love all the time. He did, but he also preached, if you're not with me, you're against me. Meaning, not all roads are going to lead to heaven, right? So if you're not with me, if you're not walking on my road, then you're going to hell. That's basically what he's saying. But also, look at this. Sin always has relation to God and his will. The older theologians, as you read theologians from past centuries, they always, when they talked about sin, they talked about God and his will. They talked about who God is and what his will was. Again, this is why when we read that you can look at the other side, when we read Erickson's definition, and when we read Ant's definition, and when we read Ryrie's definition, all of them in one way or another are saying that sin is lack of conformity to God's law. Because it is. Because sin really is that. Sin wouldn't be sin if God didn't think it was sin. It was wrong. This is why sin is always, it's always basically glued to who God is. Again, we said it the first week or the second week we did this, the class, right? If you don't have the right view of God, the right view of sin, then your view of and God, then you wouldn't understand who God is. If you think sin is not a big deal, then you think God is not a big deal. It's that idea is right there. So when we look at this, we need to understand that sin, God hates sin. That there isn't that thing where, well, some sins are okay. No, God hates all sin. They're a transgression of God's law. And you have verses in the Bible. You can look at, we don't have time to do this, but if we did, we would be reading Romans chapter 1 and Romans chapter 2 to see this. How sin, and chapter 3 as well, I guess we can do all three. How sin has that character that deals with God. You cannot separate the two, God and sin. Because God is the one that sets the standard. And sin is what breaks that standard. Look at E. Sin includes guilt and pollution. Sin includes guilt and pollution. What is guilt? What's that?
It's a conscience of...
Okay, yeah. So that's part of it. What else? Judgment. What else? Like we are judged. Okay. What else? Regret, shame. So when we look at guilt, it's basically the state of deserving condemnation, basically what you guys said, and of being liable of punishment for the violation of a law or a moral requirement. It expresses the relation which sin bears to justice and to the penalty of law. Sin is that, we could say this, sin is that psychological guilt, that feeling of regret, that feeling of remorse that you guys have said. There's that feeling that I've done something wrong. But it's also that legal guilt that you guys also said. It's the forensic state of being in the wrong and worthy of punishment. And that's what sin does, right? Sin not only produces that remorse, but also sin places you under judgment. Now you're guilty. And not only that, not only you're guilty, but there's going to be a punishment meted out to you. So the only way that you can be saved is not by someone saying, oh, you're not guilty anymore. Someone needs to pay for that price. Right? And we know about the work of Jesus. But it's not this thing where someday God gets up from bed and says, you know what? We're not only gonna have sin, but we're gonna have, guilt as well associated with it. And the next day he gets up and says, you know what? I'm gonna forgive everyone. Because, who cares? They're my law anyway. And if he did that, he would be unjust. And that's the idea when we say that sin includes guilt and pollution. Now, we saw the guilt part, right? Now, what is pollution? Pollution, it's an old word, and I use that word on purpose because that word has been lost to us lately because we think of, oh, look at this city, is so polluted, right? Or look at that stream of water, is polluted. But what it meant back, and it still means the same, but we don't use it as much, is that idea of corruption. Sin has a corrupting effect on the person. This is a reality in the life of every individual. Sin always brings guilt, and it brings that corruption, complete corruption. And this is what we're going to look at in the future when we looked at the fact that now, because of sin, all of us are born, are conceived in sin, and we are sinners from the moment we are conceived. Again, when your kids are born, they're cute, and you look at them and they smile at you, but really they're sinners from the get-go. Frida. We can. Yeah. Of course, yeah. Exactly. And I think what happened, yeah, exactly. I think that it's that goes with the idea of like either, yeah, we're gonna look at that. When we look at the fall and the effects of the fall, we're gonna see the hardening of the heart. We're gonna see how really, like the Bible says, we have a heart of stone. I think it's interesting to know that even in the hardened heart, the unbeliever knows there's something like right and wrong out there. There's always something in there. They wouldn't say it's the Bible. They wouldn't say, but there's something in it. Unless you're a sociopath, you see that there is like right and wrong. They know. Why? That's my question usually. How do you know that's wrong? How do you know that's right? Well, I was raised that way. No, it's not that, right? Why? We know why, but they don't know why. But yes, we're going to look at that when we look at the fall. Do we understand that idea, right, of the pollution, the guilt and pollution, right? I think that seldom do we think, we know about guilt, but we think more of this idea of feeling guilty. But then we also know the corruption of the pollution, but we think more about other people, right? But the fact is, your baby, as cute as he or she is, or your toddler, is corrupted. Your teenager, it's easier to see, right? You're like, he's corrupted. He's not saved. But your baby is corrupted from the moment that they were born. All right. Look at F. Sin has its seat in the heart. Sin has its seat in the heart. We sometimes have a hard time seeing this. That sin, and by heart, we don't mean obviously that organ that pumps blood all over your body, right? What do we mean when we say sin has its seat in the heart? The inner man, right? Like that's what's corrupted, right? So yeah, so what it does is sin affects from inside of you, affects your whole entire body. A verse that I love, it's in Proverbs 4:23. It's a verse that every child should learn it. Watch over your heart with all diligence, from it flow the springs of life. Not long ago, I remember I was eating a Panda Express. I opened up the fortune cookie. No, this verse wasn't there. But I love the fortune cookies. I don't like to eat them, but I like to see the wisdom that is inside. And half the time, I take a picture and send it to a friend, and we laugh. But this one was really, really convicted. I did not take a picture of it because it was very convicting. It said, "You want to know a man? Listen to his words." And that's the idea, right? From inside your heart, you see that sin really changes everything. Everything, everything, everything. It changes, it starts in your heart and it changes your body. Your body decays because of sin. It changes your will. The hardening that you were talking about, that happens with it, right? Sin has this effect in the heart, and it changes everything. Sometimes we like to attack only the exterior of someone. Oh, he is involved in this sin. But the problem is inside, right? We must attack. And what I mean attack is we must focus on the heart. That's where sin happens. And look at, we're not going to be able to finish all the notes. Next week we'll finish all the notes, which is great. Look at G. Sin does not consist exclusively in overt acts. What does that mean? It means that sin doesn't consist only in just things that you can see, some tangible things, but it also includes sinful habits and the sinful condition of the soul. Do you hear that? The sinful condition of the soul, sinful habits, and sinful deeds. And what does that mean? It means this. These three are related. The sinful state is who you are as a person, as a sinner, is the basis. Just think of a pyramid, right? If I had something to write with, we would write it. We'd do like a pyramid right here. The foundation is your heart, your sinful soul. The sinful state is the basis, the foundation. But then on top of that, so the next level would be sinful deeds. Sinful deeds. The things that you do, right? The things the sinful acts. And then last of all, you would have the sinful habits, right on top. So you have sinful habits, you have the sinful deeds, and then the sinful state. What does that mean? It means that you're a sinner, right? Your heart is a sinner. A person out there can only sin because that's the only thing they know is sin. And that manifests itself in doing sin and constantly sinning. And that leads to sinful habits. That idea that that person is practicing lawlessness constantly. Repeated sinful deeds lead to establishment of sinful habits. I heard a quote, no, I don't remember who it was, but he was talking to young men, guys that were in between, I think, 13 and 15. And he said, guys, whatever you give yourself over to and sinfully in the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to spend your life trying to undo those sinful habits. And those of us who've been around a while, we've seen that, right? Not in others, we've seen it in ours, in our heart, right? Whatever you give over yourself to it right now, even as a believer, you're going to have a really hard time trying to undo those sinful habits. And that's the idea here, right? Your sinful state, who you are as a sinner, your nature being a sinner, then your deeds, and then finally your sinful habits. So in conclusion, we don't want to run over. Sin may be defined as a lack of conformity to the moral law of God, either in act, disposition, or state. And this is why we're so thankful for Christ, right? And what he did for us. We're thankful that he, in a sense, came into this world to live like one of us without sin. And he died the death that we deserve and lived the life that we could not have lived so that we can be his righteousness. Isn't it incredible? Next week, what we're going to look at is we're going to talk a little bit about Adam and Eve before the fall. And as we're going to start this new topic on the origin of sin, where did sin come from? So let me pray for us. Father, we are so thankful for who you are. We're thankful for your salvation. As we look at our sin, we are amazed to see that you are a God that has actively sought us, even when we were nothing to look at. And yet you are now our Father. You adopted us into your family. Father, may we live in light of that. May we worship you now as we are in the service in light of that we are saved sinners for your glory. Amen. Thank you, guys.